He did not look at her when he tore the mate bond. Alpha King Valerius Draken stood before his council, his voice cold as iron as he declared her too fragile to bear the crown. She did not beg. She did not tell him that her womb already held the golden spark of the Lycan lineage. She simply turned her back on his court and vanished into the fog. The hour leading up to that devastating fracture had been steeped in an ancient, oppressive grandeur. The grand cathedral of the northern frost spires was a monolith carved directly into the heart of a glacier. It was a fortress built on the bones of ancient wars, a place where mercy was considered a fatal flaw. Its vaulted ceilings stretched so high into the darkness that the torchlight failed to reach the apex, leaving the banners of the founding packs suspended in deep shadow. 200 thick wax candles burned along the colonnades, their golden flames flickering against the sightings that swept through the stone corridors. 1,000 wolves had gathered in the great hall. The sovereign guard lined the walls in their heavy iron armor, their faces obscured by grim wolf-skull helms. The silence in the room was absolute, pregnant with a tension that tasted like copper and ozone. She stood at the altar in ceremonial white, dressed in silk and silver, waiting for the man she loved to speak her name. The fabric clung to her slender frame, a stark, luminous contrast against the dark, frozen rock of the sanctuary. Evelyn Sterling kept her chin raised. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her. She had spent months trying to prove her worth to the realm, studying their ancient texts, learning the healing arts, bleeding for their acceptance. Yet she was still judged solely as a wolfless omega, a female born without the ability to shift, surrounded by apex predators who viewed her very existence as a cosmic mistake. Despite the overwhelming hostility pressing down on her, she did not tremble. The delicate, wild moonflower scent of her aura remained steady, a quiet anchor midst the aggressive, territorial musk of the gathered nobility. Valerius ascended the dais. He moved with the lethal fluid grace of a dominant predator, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy cloak of black fur. The terrifying pressure of his aura rolled through the room, forcing weaker wolves to immediately lower their gazes in submission. His scent, a harsh, intoxicating blend of frozen pine and ozone, suffocated the hall. But when he finally reached the highest step, he did not reach for her hand. He did not step into the sacred circle drawn in silver dust. He stood exactly one pace outside of it. His knuckles were stark white, where they gripped the hilt of his broadsword. The muscle in his jaw feathered, but his face looked like it had been carved from winter itself. The bloodline of the Iron Crowns requires strength, the king began, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that shook the floorboards beneath their feet. The throne of this empire cannot be anchored by a mortal shell. It requires a shifted wolf. It requires a warrior who can stand against the darkness. He paused. The silence in the cathedral was deafening. Evelyn Sterling possesses neither. The words struck her like physical blows. Her breath hitched, but she forced her lungs to expand, refusing to let her distress show. The Alpha King's rejection was not just a broken promise. It was a political spectacle designed to cement his absolute authority. Valerius had chosen the safety of his borders over the sanctity of his soul. In the shadowed alcoves to the right of the dais, Lysandra Vane leaned against a marble pillar. The daughter of the High Lord was draped in crimson velvet, her lips curved into a sharp, venomous smirk. The rival had spent months whispering poison into the ears of the High Chancellor, cultivating the exact political pressure that was now crushing the young bride's future. Lysandra waited for the pathetic, weak girl to shatter. She waited for the wailing to begin. "I reject this bond." 4 words. That was all it took to sever a destiny. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Everyone in the cathedral expected the fragile Omega to crumble completely. They waited for her to fall to her knees on the unforgiving ice, to weep, to beg for the mercy of the crown. She did none of those things. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. The mate bond snapped inside her chest with the violence of a falling guillotine. It was a brutal, physiological agony. It felt as though a serrated blade was being dragged slowly through her ribcage, setting her veins on invisible fire. Her spiritual essence, the hidden soul the council claimed did not exist, wailed in the deepest recesses of her mind, thrashing against the sudden, terrifying void. Her pulse roared in her ears. Her vision blurred at the edges, swimming with dark spots. The pain was absolute. It was blinding, but she swallowed the blood rising in her throat. She pulled her shoulders back, her spine snapping perfectly straight. Slowly, the young woman reached for her left hand. Her fingers, steady and methodical, gripped the silver solstice band that adorned her ring finger. The metal had been warm just moments ago, heated by the biological proximity of her true mate. Now, it burned her skin like dry ice. She slid the heavy, intricate ring off over her knuckle. She did not hesitate. She placed the band onto the flat surface of the cold stone altar. The metallic clink of the silver hitting the glacier stone echoed louder than a thunderclap. Lysandra's cruel smile faltered, her painted lips parting in utter confusion, as the expected entertainment failed to materialize. The council elders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging bewildered glances. A rejected female was meant to be a weeping, shattered thing. The ousted bride standing before them was a ghost of terrifying dignity. She did not look at the Alpha King. She did not offer a single word of protest or anger. She simply turned her back on the highest court of the land. Her white silk skirts swept silently over the frozen floor as she walked down the long, shadowed aisle. She walked away. The heavy oak doors of the royal chambers closed with a soft, final thud, sealing out the frantic whispers that had already begun to infect the palace halls. Evelyn moved through the cavernous bedroom with mechanical, unfeeling precision. There was no time for grief. Grief was an expensive luxury she could no longer afford. The heavy velvet curtains, embroidered with the silver crescent of the Dracon line, seemed to mock her as she opened a simple, worn leather trunk at the foot of the massive four-poster bed. She ignored the lavish silk gowns and jewel-encrusted bodices the king had gifted her. Instead, she began folding the plain, practical woolen garments that had belonged to her before a cruel twist of fate had brought her to the capital. A soft click of the iron latch broke the oppressive silence. Martha Sterling slipped into the room, locking the heavy deadbolt behind her. The older woman's face was grim, her skin etched with the deep lines of a pragmatic healer who had spent decades mending the broken bodies of wolves. She had been the only one in the capital who had seen past the wolfless label, knowing the true depth of her niece's resilience. She did not offer useless pity. She did not attempt to embrace the girl. Pity would only unravel the fragile composure keeping them both alive. "The carriage is waiting at the postern gate," the healer said quietly, moving to the mahogany vanity to sweep several vials of medicinal tinctures into a leather satchel. "The guards are changing shifts at the western wall. We have exactly 10 minutes before the Chancellor's spies realize you are not weeping quietly in your bed." Evelyn nodded once. Her hands did not tremble as she clasped a heavy, dark grey wool cloak over her shoulders. The thick fabric completely buried the ceremonial white dress, erasing the bride and leaving only the survivor. The cold draft howling through the stone window carried the vicious bite of an approaching blizzard. The freezing air mingled with her wild moonflower scent, stripping away the artificial warmth of the castle and grounding her in the harsh, unforgiving reality of her immediate exile. "Garrick Thorne will expect you to flee to the southern packs," the older woman murmured, handing the heavy satchel over and adjusting her own woolen shawl. "He will send trackers there just to ensure you are truly gone. We will head north, toward the Whispering Valley. It is neutral territory. No king claims the borderlands. Lead the way," the young woman whispered. It was the first time she had spoken since the altar. Her voice was entirely hollow. Down below, the courtyard was a chaotic swirl of blinding white snow and jagged, dark iron gates. The unmarked carriage rolled out of the stables, its wheels muffled by the heavy drifts. The iron portcullis shrieked as it was raised just enough for the small transport to slip under. The guards on duty, bribed with heavy silver and sworn to secrecy, turned their faces away from the freezing wind. The carriage slipped like a forgotten shadow through the fortress walls, disappearing into the teeth of the tempest. She did not look back at the grand fortress that was supposed to be her forever home. The past was dead, buried under the rapidly accumulating snow. High above the towering gates, standing on a jutting stone balcony exposed to the brutal elements, the Alpha King stood motionless. Valerius wore no cloak. The violent blizzard whipped at his dark hair, coating his broad shoulders in a thick layer of frost. The snow melted against the feverish heat of his skin, yet he was shivering. His molten amber eyes were fixed with terrifying intensity on the lone carriage, fading into the whiteout below. He watched her leave like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. The sovereign seal of Drakon felt unbearably heavy in his right hand. The golden scroll of succession, freshly stamped in blood wax, was a physical manifestation of his ultimate duty to the realm. He had done what the High Council demanded. He had surgically cut away the kingdom's perceived weakness. He had secured the future of the crown against the plotting of the High Lords, who would have used a mortal queen to tear his empire apart from the inside. It was a calculated, necessary political sacrifice, but as the tiny silhouette of the carriage was finally swallowed by the mist, a sudden, violent spasm seized his chest. The king clutched the stone balustrade. The solid granite cracked under his immense, uncontrollable grip. The severed bond was bleeding violently inside him. It was not a political wound. It was a phantom hemorrhage tearing through his very soul. He had expected to feel relief. He had expected the clean, sharp, unfeeling cold of absolute command to settle over him. Instead, an unfathomable, crushing regret clawed at the back of his throat. It suffocated him, filling his lungs with the phantom scent of fading moonflowers. His knees buckled slightly, a momentary physical failure that no one was there to witness. The king, who had slaughtered rogue armies without blinking, was brought to his knees by a phantom pain. He closed his eyes against the biting snow. The sovereign had successfully won his court, but the man had just destroyed his entire world. The carriage wheels crunched violently over black ice and jagged stone. For 3 days and 3 unforgiving nights, Evelyn sat in the freezing transport, staring blankly at the frost forming on the small window pane, watching her past recede into a white, featureless blur. When the terrifying iron-wrought towers of the capital finally faded behind the jagged mountain peaks, the biting winds began to soften. The Whispering Valley borderlands welcomed the exiles, not with grand fanfares or imposing stone walls, but with the quiet, indifferent embrace of ancient pine woods and untouched, loamy earth. They settled in a weathered, sturdy cabin hidden deep within a protective crescent of towering trees. The roof groaned under the weight of the snowfall, but the thick timber walls held fast. It was a shelter built by forgotten outcasts, a perfect sanctuary for a rejected queen. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the imposing, frozen majesty of the royal keep. Here there were no vaulted cathedral ceilings to echo her uneven breathing. There were no calculating lords watching her every step from the shadows. There was only the warm, crackling hearth, the earthy smell of damp soil, and the absolute, terrifying silence of total freedom. Weeks bled into a harsh, secluded winter. Evelyn adapted to the solitary life with a stoic, unyielding determination. She traded the last of her fine silks for rough spun wool and thick leather boots. Her hands, once manicured for royal presentation, quickly learned the brutal friction of chopping firewood and hauling heavy buckets of water from the half-frozen stream. The icy numbness that had encased her heart since the disastrous solstice ceremony began to thaw slowly was replaced by a fierce, quiet instinct for basic survival. But her body was changing in ways that defied simple exhaustions or the strain of manual labor. She had attributed the lingering nausea to the bumpy carriage ride, the deep exhaustion to the severe trauma of the severed bond. It happened on a night when the snow fell so thick it completely blotted out the light of the moon. The exiled Omega stood by the stone fireplace, quietly brewing a bitter tea from the dried supplies Martha had foraged. A sudden, sharp heat flared deep within her lower abdomen. It was not a cramp of illness. It was a massive surge of raw, crackling energy. She gasped and dropped the wooden spoon. It clattered loudly against the stone hearth. Her hands flew to her stomach, her breath hitching painfully in her throat. The heat pulsed again. It was stronger this time, sending a golden, luminous wave rippling vividly beneath her pale skin. The young woman closed her eyes, forcing her panic down and letting her consciousness sink inward. The magic she had suppressed her entire life, the ancient, dormant ember of her bloodline she had hidden from the ignorant hierarchy, reached out blindly to meet the foreign, powerful sparks growing inside her. There were two distinct, overwhelming heartbeats thrummed against her magical senses. They pulsed with the undeniable, earth-shattering power of the Lycan crest. Her latent magic flared violently in response to their presence, illuminating the dark, dusty cabin with a brief, blinding flash of pure gold. The ancient magic, a force older and far more dangerous than the shifting wolves, had remained dormant to protect her. Now, it surged forward to protect the fragile lives taking root inside her womb. The golden light spilled from her fingertips, weaving invisible threads of ancient protection around her, locking the scent of the royal pups away from any scrying magic. The air suddenly grew heavy with the distinct scent of sharp ozone and frozen pine, a miniaturized, undeniable echo of the powerful king she had left behind. Evelyn sank heavily to the wooden floorboards, her trembling hands clutching the thick fabric of her woolen skirts. She was carrying the royal heirs, twin boys. She could feel their ancient lineage radiating in the dark, a golden spark that demanded to be acknowledged by the universe. The High Chancellor had called her barren. Valerius had discarded her as a fragile, useless mortal shell. They didn't know. A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway. Evelyn opened her eyes. The irises shimmered with a quiet, lethal resolve that had never existed before the rejection. She would never let the northern frost spires touch them. She would never let a crown of ice break her unborn sons the way it had broken their father. The defensive wall inside her chest was now fully built, cemented by an overwhelming maternal ferocity. She did not need a crown to be a protector. She did not need a pack to be a mother. The banished woman wrapped her arms protectively over her stomach, staring fiercely into the roaring flames of the hearth as the blizzard howled outside in the dark. The wolves of the capital had cast out a weak Omega. Completely unaware, they had just unleashed the most dangerous entity in their realm. 5 years later, the howling blizzards of that fateful night had long since surrendered to the quiet, mossy dampness of the Whispering Valley. The secluded cabin sat nestled within a protective ring of ancient redwoods, its heavy timber walls weathered by half a decade of harsh, unforgiving seasons. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in thin golden ribbons, illuminating the dust motes dancing lazily in the still morning air. Evelyn Sterling knelt in the soft loam of her herb garden. Her hands, once painstakingly manicured for courtly displays and royal expectations, were now calloused and stained with dark earth. She did not mind the dirt beneath her fingernails. The soil felt real. It felt like survival. She carefully pruned a cluster of bitter root, her wild moonflower scent mingling harmoniously with the sharp, natural tang of crushed pine needles. A sudden burst of childish laughter shattered the serene silence. Evelyn paused. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist and turned her gaze toward the edge of the clearing. 2 small figures tumbled through the tall ferns, wrestling over a carved wooden sword. Caelan Dracon pinned his brother to the moss. The boy was small for his age, yet he moved with an eerie, fluid grace that did not belong to a mortal child. He laughed, a bright chiming sound that echoed cheerfully through the surrounding trees. Beneath him, Balin Dracon did not laugh. The second twin possessed a quiet, brooding intensity that was terrifyingly familiar. He shoved Caelan off with a sudden, forceful heave that sent the older boy tumbling backward into the brush. As Balin sat up, his frustration flared uncontrollably. It happened in a fraction of a second. The deep brown of the boy's irises vanished, consumed instantly by a blazing molten amber. The air pressure in the clearing dropped like a stone. A low, barely audible hum vibrated through the earth, a physical manifestation of pure, unfiltered dominance. The mother stood up. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the heavy air like a steel whip. "Balin!" The boy froze. He looked toward the garden, his small chest heaving rapidly. The golden glow in his eyes was blinding, an undeniable mirror of the sovereign who had broken her at the altar. The exiled Omega wiped her hands on her coarse woolen apron and walked slowly toward her sons. She did not project fear. She projected absolute, unyielding calm. When she reached them, she knelt, bringing her face level with the fiercely glowing child. She reached into the collar of his linen tunic and pulled out a heavy, intricately carved stone tied to a thick leather cord. The lunar amber pendant caught the morning light. "What is our first rule?" she whispered, pressing the cool, ancient stone flat against his racing heart. Balin swallowed hard, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We do not show the gold. Why? Because the gold draws the shadows," Kaelin answered softly, from the grass, his own eyes firmly locked onto the dirt in a display of practiced submission. "Because the shadows bite, exactly." She brushed a stray lock of dark hair from Balin's forehead. Her touch was infinitely gentle, yet it carried the heavy weight of 1,000 unspoken terrors. Slowly, the molten fire in the boy's irises receded, bleeding back into a dull, safe brown. The oppressive weight in the air lifted entirely. She pulled him into her chest, burying her face in his hair. He smelled of rain and crushed leaves, but beneath it there was the faint, unmistakable tang of winter ozone. It terrified her deep in her bones. Their magic was growing stronger with every passing month, pushing violently against the boundaries she had painstakingly woven to hide them from the scrying eyes of the capital. Every single day, the dormant power inside them fought to be recognized by the world. "There is no wolf too broken to be worthy." She had whispered those words to herself in the dark during the hardest nights of her pregnancy. But her sons were not broken. They were perfect. They were the true, undeniable heirs of an empire that did not even know they existed. She stood up, taking a steadying breath, and guided them back toward the warmth of the hearth. 100 miles away, the wind howled a completely different tune. The carriage rolled through the jagged, treacherous mountain pass, its iron-reinforced wheels violently crushing the loose stones beneath them. Inside the dark, velvet-lined interior, the air was suffocatingly cold. Valerius Dracon sat entirely motionless in the shadows. He wore his heavy iron armor, the dark metal absorbing the minimal light that filtered through the frosted glass. His face looked like it had been carved from winter itself. 5 years had passed since the solstice ceremony, yet the Alpha King carried the physical weight of a century. The skin around his eyes was bruised with chronic, inescapable exhaustion. The terrifying, dominant aura that once brought entire armies to their knees was now frayed at the edges, brittle, and intensely volatile. He stared blankly at the thick parchment resting on his armored knee. The border treaty document was a miserable piece of political theater, a requirement to maintain peace with the neutral territories. He did not care about the treaty. He did not care about the borders. "You must secure the Southern Alliance before the deep freezes set in." A grating voice broke the suffocating silence. Garrick Thorne sat opposite the sovereign. The High Chancellor of the Lycan Council looked immaculate, his silver-streaked hair pulled back tightly, his rich robes lined with expensive fox fur. He exuded an air of calculated, arrogant impatience. "The lords are growing highly restless, my king. A realm without a designated heir is a realm begging for a bloody civil war. Lady Lysandra is still waiting. She has proven herself capable, politically strong, and entirely willing to bear your pups." The king did not blink. He did not look at the older wolf. "Do not speak her name," the sovereign murmured. His voice was dangerously low, a lethal rumble that vibrated menacingly through the wooden floorboards. The Chancellor shifted uncomfortably, though his blind ambition ultimately outweighed his caution. My lord, it has been half a decade since you purged the weak link from the throne. You made the hard, necessary choice for the survival of the Empire. But a king cannot rule on ghosts. You severed the bond. You must move on. A muscle feathered violently in the sovereign's jaw. Severed. The word was a profound mockery. The council believed a mate bond could simply be erased by royal decree, like a line of ink crossed out on a trade contract. They did not feel the phantom hemorrhage that bled him dry every single night. They did not feel the agonizing, icy void constantly expanding in his chest, a black hole that swallowed every ounce of warmth he desperately tried to generate. When he tore the connection at the altar, he thought he was cutting away a mortal vulnerability. Instead, he had brutally amputated his own soul. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her white silk dress dragging across the stone floor. He smelled fading moonflowers in empty, shadowed corridors. He woke up with blood on his hands from digging his claws into his own chest, desperately trying to physically rip out the phantom pain. The treaty will be signed at the outpost, Valerius stated. His tone was entirely flat, completely ignoring the advisor's lecture. We will not linger. We sign and we ride back before dusk. As you command, Garrick sighed. Clearly frustrated by the impenetrable wall of ice his ruler had permanently become. The king turned his gaze back to the frosted window. The transport breached the final mountain ridge, revealing the sprawling, misty expanse of the borderlands below. The neutral territory was dense, wild, and utterly silent. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the sovereign's heart executed a painful, stuttering rhythm. A strange, inexplicable pull tugged viciously at the hollow cavity in his chest. It was weak, almost imperceptible, like a dying ember catching a sudden, violent draught of air. He frowned, his molten amber eyes narrowing at the sea of green canopy below. He dismissed the sensation instantly, as another cruel, agonizing trick of his fractured mind. There was nothing for him down there. There was only dirt and shadows. The shadows in the valley were already growing long. The canopy above had thickened into a near-impenetrable ceiling of dark pine and twisting oak branches. 2 miles away from the safety of the cabin, the twins had strayed much further than ever before. They were tracking a strange, glowing beetle, their small leather boots crunching softly against the damp forest floor. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the metallic scent of impending rain. Suddenly, the ambient noises of the forest died, the birds stopped singing, the wind ceased rattling the leaves. A profound, unnatural silence dropped over the woods, heavy and suffocating. Balin stopped in his tracks. The younger twin tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Do you smell that?" he whispered. Calin froze. He dropped the wooden stick he was carrying, blood and rot. A low, guttural snarl vibrated from the thick brush directly ahead of them. The heavy ferns parted violently. A massive creature stepped out into the clearing. It was a feral drake wolf, an abominable hybrid bred in the lawless fighting pits of the northern rogues, long abandoned to the wild. The beast was the size of a warhorse, its body covered in matted, wire-like fur and thick, scaly plating along its arched spine. Viscous saliva dripped from its oversized, jagged jaws. Its eyes were milky white with absolute madness. It was starving. The monster locked its blind gaze onto the 2 small children. It let out a deafening, terrifying roar that physically shook the pine needles from the branches above. Any mortal child would have screamed. Any normal pup would have turned and run, triggering the apex predator's prey drive instantly. The twins did not run. Balin stepped forward, deliberately placing his small body directly in front of his brother. His hands clenched into tiny fists at his sides. The stone hidden beneath his shirt grew searing hot against his collarbone. He did not reach for it. He did not try to suppress the surge. "Get back," the boy commanded. His voice was a child's, high and unbroken, but it layered instantly with a deep, reverberating, ancient resonance that defied all logic. The drake wolf snapped its massive jaws and lunged. Calin stepped up right beside his brother. Their shoulders touched. Simultaneously, The children opened their eyes wide. The illusion of brown shattered completely into dust. Blazing incandescent gold erupted from their irises. The sheer force of their latent Lycan authority exploded outward in a massive shockwave of kinetic pressure. The air literally warped around them. The ground beneath their boots cracked. The bond snapped it into place like a key turning in a lock, seamlessly connecting the ancient magic of their mother with the apex dominance of their father's suppressed bloodline. The lunging monster slammed violently into the invisible wall of their combined aura. It yelped, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of absolute terror, and crashed hard into the dirt. The feral beast, driven by years of madness and starvation, scrambled backward frantically. It whimpered loudly, pressing its massive, scaly belly flat against the forest floor. It dragged itself forward an inch at a time, whining in total, unbreakable submission, bowing its heavy head until its wet snout touched the tips of Balin's boots. The boy stared down at the terrifying creature. His golden eyes were entirely devoid of fear. He reached out a small, steady hand and placed it flat against the monster's blood-stained snout. "Be still," he whispered. The beast closed its milky eyes and let out a long, shuddering sigh, entirely tamed. A sharp crack of breaking timber echoed loudly from the ridge behind them. Through the dense foliage, a contingent of heavily armed soldiers broke into the clearing, their silver swords already drawn, responding rapidly to the beast's initial roar. At the head of the border patrol, sitting tall atop a massive black warhorse, was the Alpha King. Valerius pulled hard on his leather reins, his mount rearing slightly as it took in the impossible, logic-defying scene. The sovereign's sword was half-drawn from its iron scabbard. His chest was heaving, fully prepared for a bloody slaughter. But there was no slaughter. There was only a monstrous drake-wolf groveling pathetically in the dirt, and two small boys standing fearlessly over it. The air in the clearing turned to absolute ice. The king's heart simply stopped beating. The two children turned their heads slowly to look at the armored men. The golden light in their eyes had not yet faded. It burned with the exact, undeniable, terrifying amber fire of the Dracon dynasty. Valerius stared down from his high saddle. His breath left his lungs in a ragged, freezing white cloud. The world around him slowed to a painful, excruciating crawl. He saw the sharp shape of their jaws. He saw the raven-black hair whipping in the wind. He felt the overwhelming, undeniable biological resonance slamming into his chest like a steel battering ram. The sovereign dropped his sword. The heavy iron blade hit the forest floor with a dull thud. He did not hear it. He could only hear the deafening roar of a truth he had been entirely blind to for 5 agonizing years. Valerius swung his armored leg over the saddle. His movements were completely mechanical, stripped of their usual terrifying grace. His heavy boots hit the forest floor with a dull crunch. He did not signal his elite men to stand down. He did not issue a single command. He did not even look at them. He simply walked forward. The massive feral drake-wolf slithered desperately into the underbrush to escape his suffocating presence, but he did not notice. His entire universe had abruptly, violently narrowed down to the 2 small figures standing in the center of the clearing. The freezing pine and ozone that always surrounded the Alpha King clashed violently with the static heat of the children's untamed aura. He stopped 3 paces away. Up close, the impossible truth was even more devastating to his fractured mind. The boy standing slightly in front had his jawline, sharp, inherently stubborn. The one positioned cautiously behind carried the exact haughty, defiant tilt of his chin, but it was their eyes that paralyzed the king. They burned with the ancestral fire of the first founders. They carried the faint, star-shaped geometric pattern of the Lycan council crest buried deep within the pupil. It could not be faked. It could not be stolen. His massive chest convulsed. The phantom wound where he had ripped the mate bond apart 5 years ago suddenly seared with white-hot agony. It was not the dull ache of a severed tie. It was the violent, excruciating kickstart of a dead heart recognizing its missing pieces in the physical world. He dropped heavily to one knee. The cold mud soaked instantly into the thick fabric of his trousers. He did not feel it. He reached out a trembling, leather-clad hand. His fingers hovered mere inches from the younger boy's cheek. He was terrified to touch the child. Terrified they were a hallucination born of his own inescapable grief. "What are your names?" the monarch whispered. His voice was raw. It sounded like a man who had not tasted water in a decade. Balin did not flinch away from the towering predator. The child stared at the armored warlord with absolute, chilling calm. The golden fire in his small eyes did not waver. "My mother says we do not speak to shadows." The answer felt like a physical blow to the ribs. Valerius inhaled sharply. His breath caught painfully on the freezing air. He shifted his gaze to the older twin. Kaelin was watching him with a quiet, analytical intensity that was completely unnatural for a 5-year-old. The boy's eyes moved from the man's exhausted face to the intricate silver armor, then down to the empty scabbard in the dirt. He was processing the threat level with the cold, detached logic of a born ruler. "You wear the Iron Crown," Kaelin stated simply. He did not bow. "You are the one from the ice." The apex predator swallowed hard. The air had turned to glass in his lungs. He had convinced himself she was barren. He had stood before the entire high court of the northern frost spires and declared her utterly devoid of the necessary strength to carry the royal lineage. Yet here they stood, two perfect, terrifyingly powerful sons, wielding the ancient magic of his ancestors with the casual ease of breathing. The realization of what he had carelessly thrown away began to actively suffocate him. "Who is your mother?" he choked out, though his soul already knew the answer. The scent of rain and crushed leaves clung heavily to the boys, but beneath it, buried deep in the coarse fabric of their tunics, was a scent he knew, the faint, unmistakable, heartbreaking fragrance of wild moonflowers. The twins exchanged a brief, entirely silent look. They communicated without moving their lips, a flawless physiological link that excluded the rest of the world. Then Balin raised a small, dirt-smudged finger and pointed toward the dense tree line to the north. "She is waiting," the boy said. Valerius stood up. His knees felt physically weak. He turned back to his men. The border patrol sat frozen on their war horses, their eyes wide with profound awe. They had all seen the glowing eyes. They all understood exactly what that sacred crest meant for the future of the late age of the Iron Crowns. "Hold your positions," the sovereign commanded. The lethal rumble had returned to his tone, but it was fragile. "Do not follow me." He walked. The twins led the way, their small boots moving silently over the fallen autumn leaves. The forest grew darker as the canopy thickened, shutting out the fading afternoon sun. With every step away from his soldiers, the temperature around him began to inexplicably rise. The suffocating, eternal winter that had lived inside his bones for half a decade began to thaw. A painful, prickling heat made his skin crawl with anticipation. Then, the dense trees broke. The secluded cabin sat perfectly integrated into the lush landscape of the Whispering Valley borderlands. It was surrounded by an immaculate herb garden and neat, towering stacks of chopped firewood. It was a peaceful sanctuary, a warm, breathing home built entirely without his protection. Valerius stopped dead at the edge of the clearing. His molten eyes locked instantly onto the wooden porch. Evelyn was there. She was sitting on a weathered wooden bench, calmly repairing a tear in a small woolen cloak with a bone needle. She wore a simple undyed linen dress. It draped softly over her curves. Her dark hair was braided loosely over one shoulder. She did not look like a broken, banished outcast. She looked like a goddess of the earth, radiant, deeply grounded, entirely untouchable. The frail, sickly pallor she had carried in the freezing stone walls of the capital was gone. Her skin was flushed with vibrant health. The sheer, quiet life force radiating from her hit the Alpha like a physical shockwave to the sternum. The boys ran past the property line. They did not rush to their mother in panic or fear. They simply walked up to the base of the porch. Their golden eyes faded obediently back to a dull brown, their wild magic settling instantly under her silent ambient authority. "Wash your hands," she murmured. Her voice carried the soft, musical cadence he had spent 5 agonized years trying to forget. The stew is almost ready. Kalen and Balin nodded in unison. They disappeared around the side of the timber structure toward the water pump. The exiled Omega tied off the heavy thread. She bit the end of the string with her teeth to snap it. She smoothed the mended fabric meticulously over her lap. Only then, with agonizing slowness, did she lift her chin and look across the clearing. She saw the towering, armored figure standing paralyzed in the shadows of the redwoods. She saw the man who had publicly shattered her soul and cast her into the blizzard. She did not drop the cloak. She did not gasp in shock. She did not leap to her feet in terror or vengeful rage. Evelyn simply stared at him. Her silver-grey eyes were entirely devoid of emotion. They were completely flat, offering no warmth, no residual anger, no eager recognition. It was absolute, chilling indifference. Valerius stepped out of the shadows. The afternoon sunlight caught the brutal, dented edges of his iron armor. He walked slowly toward the porch. Each step felt heavier than the last. The dormant bond inside his chest was screaming, thrashing wildly against his ribcage, desperate to bridge the physical gap between them. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps. He looked up at her face. He opened his mouth, but his throat was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his regret. 5 years ago he had stared blankly as his carriage bore her away, feeling as though his very soul had been violently ripped from his body. Now, looking at her untouchable serenity, he realized it had never returned to him. For a long, agonizing minute, there was only the sound of the wind rustling the pine needles and the distant squeak of the water pump. "They are mine," he finally breathed. It was not an authoritative demand. It was a desperate, shattering confession. Evelyn picked up a small pair of iron shears from the bench. She carefully snipped a loose stray thread from the cloak's hem. "They are mine," she corrected softly. Her tone was completely conversational, devoid of venom. "They belong to the valley. They belong to the earth. They do not belong to the northern frost spires." The monarch gripped the wooden handrail of the stairs. The ancient timber groaned and splintered under his crushing grip. He looked obsessively at her hands. They were heavily calloused. They bore the tiny, healing scratches of a woman who worked the harsh soil every single day to survive. She fixed her gaze on the broken king, searching desperately for any sign of the devastating heartbreak he had inflicted upon her. There was nothing to salvage. "You hid them from me," Valerius rasped. His voice broke. The formidable warlord was physically trembling. "For 5 years I lived in a frozen hell. I bled every single night. I thought you were dead in the snow. I thought my bloodline ended with my own arrogant failure, and you hid them." The iron shears stopped moving. Evelyn set her sewing aside. She placed her bare hands flat against her lap. She looked down at the broken king. Her gaze was as immovable as a mountain glacier. "I did not hide them," she stated clearly. "I simply lived. You are the one who declared me unfit. You are the one who stood before 500 wolves and swore my womb was a barren wasteland. I accepted your decree. My king, I left. Evelyn," he choked. The sacred name tore out of his throat like a jagged piece of glass. "Please." He took a step up the wooden stairs. The boards creaked loudly. He wanted to throw himself onto the deck at her feet. He wanted to bury his face in her lap and weep until his massive lungs gave out. The urge to grovel was violent, completely overwhelming, his heavily muscled legs locked in painful spasms. She did not recoil from his approach. She simply watched him struggle against his own demons. "A mistake happens when you lack understanding," Evelyn said. Her voice dropped to a somber, haunting register that chilled his blood. "A calculated decision is made with full awareness, and you execute it anyway. You made your choice at the altar, Valerius. You chose power. You chose the Lycan Council. You chose the cold." "I was wrong," he whispered. The admission cost him every ounce of his legendary pride. "I was blind. The throne demands visible strength, and I thought—" "You thought a wolfless Omega without a shifted form was entirely useless," she finished for him. She stood up. The simple linen dress flowed gracefully around her legs. Even without the silver solstice band, She possessed more sovereign majesty in that moment than anyone he had ever seen in the High Court. "You did not know what lived inside my blood. You still do not." He reached out. His gloved fingers grazed the very edge of her skirt. The fractional contact sent a jolt of pure, excruciating heat straight up his arm. It felt like sticking a frostbitten limb directly into a roaring hearth fire. He gasped. His amber eyes fluttered shut for a fraction of a second as the agonizing, beautiful warmth flooded his frozen veins. "Come back," he pleaded. The Alpha King, the most feared entity in the known realm, was openly begging, a man shattered, pleading with a woman in a humble apron. "Return them to me. Take them home. They are royal princes. I will give you anything you ask. I will slaughter anyone who speaks a word against you." Evelyn stared at the large, deadly hand desperately gripping the edge of her dress. She did not pull away. She did not need to retreat. "We already have the world," she replied quietly, looking out over the quiet trees. "And you have your council." The heavy, fragile silence between them was violently shattered by the sound of snapping branches, the loud, rhythmic thud of armored boots marching in unison. Valerius snapped his head around. His eyes flashed with immediate, lethal warning. His hand dropped instinctively to his empty hip, his fingers curling aggressively around the ghost of a hilt he had left miles behind in the dirt. A dozen heavily armed Lycan soldiers poured aggressively into the clearing, entirely surrounding the small property. Their pristine silver breastplates gleamed arrogantly in the afternoon sun. At their center, riding a sleek, nervous grey mare, was the High Chancellor. Garrick Thorne pulled his mount to a harsh halt. His sharp, calculating eyes swept critically over the immaculate garden, lingered briefly on the discarded wooden toys near the pump, and finally snapped up to the woman standing above the king. The older wolf's face twisted instantly into a mask of pure, aristocratic disgust. "So," the Chancellor sneered, his voice cutting through the peaceful valley air like a rusty, jagged blade. The pathetic rumors of the Border Patrol were actually true. The banished weakling did not perish in the snow after all. The sovereign slowly turned his back to the porch. He placed his massive frame directly between Evelyn and the armed intruders. His spine straightened. The desperate, broken man pleading for love vanished instantly. He was replaced entirely by a towering wall of absolute murderous violence. The scent of frozen pine and ozone thickened into a suffocating miasma. The temperature in the clearing plummeted below freezing. A thick layer of white frost crystallized across the wooden steps beneath his heavy boots. "Tread carefully, Garrick," Valerius warned. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble that promised imminent, gruesome death. "You are speaking to the mother of my heirs." The Chancellor laughed. It was a dry, hollow, entirely humorless sound. He dismounted his horse with practiced elegance, smoothing the expensive fox fur of his collar. He reached deep into his heavy velvet robes and pulled out a thick parchment sealed with black wax, the sovereign seal of Drakon. "Heirs?" the advisor mocked. He unrolled the heavy scroll with a dramatic flick of his wrist. "I see no heirs here, my Lord King. I see an exiled, wolfless Omega, who has been hiding unauthorized pups in neutral territory. By the ancient, irrefutable laws of the Lycan Council, any child born to a rejected mate outside the protective borders of the capital is deemed a rogue. They are illegitimate, an abomination to the pure bloodline." The front door of the cabin creaked open. Martha Sterling stepped out onto the porch, a heavy iron fire poker gripped tightly in her aged, trembling hands. She positioned herself firmly in front of the doorframe, physically blocking the entrance where the boys were sheltered inside. Evelyn did not look back at her aunt. She did not look at the armed soldiers surrounding her sanctuary. She looked only at the thick, black waxed scroll clutched in the Chancellor's arrogant hand. "The Council has convened via arcane relay," Garrick continued, entirely ignoring the lethal, freezing aura radiating from his monarch. He read from the document with rehearsed, bureaucratic coldness. "The children possess the royal eye trait. They are a direct, unmanaged threat to the stability of the succession. They cannot be allowed to remain in the custody of a banished, powerless commoner. They are to be seized immediately and escorted to the capital to be raised by Lysandra Vane, the designated future queen. The air physically shattered. Valerius let out a deafening roar that violently shook the earth beneath their feet. His body convulsed as his dense bones cracked, his muscles expanding violently beneath his iron armor as the furious beast beneath his skin demanded to shift and slaughter. If a single one of your men takes another step toward this porch, I will paint this entire valley with their blood. The soldiers hesitated. Their silver swords wavered nervously as they faced the apocalyptic wrath of Zovthisan. You do not have the legal authority to stop this, Valerius, Garrick shouted back, pointing a gloved accusatory finger at the king. You signed the border treaty document. The council holds the ultimate right to secure the royal bloodline across these neutral lands. Seize the boys. 3 soldiers stepped forward nervously, their eyes fixed on the wooden door behind the old woman. They never made it to the bottom of the steps. Evelyn finally moved. She walked slowly to the edge of the porch, effortlessly bypassing the massive, enraged form of the Alpha King. She stopped at the very edge of the top stair. She observed the 3 advancing soldiers from above, then directly into the eyes of the arrogant Chancellor. That brutal public dismissal was intended to shatter her spirit completely. Instead, it had merely stripped away the fragile mortal shell, leaving the divine, untouchable entity beneath. She did not shout. She did not scream for mercy. She simply let go. For 5 long years, she had meticulously woven a heavy veil of suppression over her own soul, using the lunar amber pendant to hide the ancient, terrifying power that slept in her bloodline. She dropped the veil completely. The transformation was not loud, it was absolute. The temperature in the clearing did not drop. It skyrocketed. The thick frost that Valerius had just created on the stairs instantly vaporized into a loud hiss of blinding steam. The air around the exiled woman warped and shimmered with intense, visible, scorching heat. A blinding, pure golden light began to spill rapidly from her silver-grey eyes. It was far brighter and infinitely more ancient than the amber traits of the Dracon dynasty. It was the Phoenix Fire. The raw, unadulterated magic of the first ancestors, the original flame that birthed the shifter souls. The wild moonflower scent expanded outward in a massive tidal wave. It turned heavy, intoxicating, completely suffocating. The 3 advancing soldiers dropped to their knees simultaneously. Their weapons clattered to the dirt. Their hands flew to their throats as they gasped helplessly for air that was suddenly too heavy to breathe. Garrick Thorne stumbled backward. His arrogant sneer melted instantly into an expression of primal horror. The sovereign seal of Dracon slipped from his trembling, useless fingers, landing forgotten in the dirt. Valerius stood frozen on the stairs. The Alpha King, the most dominant predator in the known realm, felt his own massive knees buckle under the sheer, mythological weight of the aura pressing down on the clearing. He looked up in absolute awe at the woman he had foolishly discarded for being too weak. You speak of ancient laws, Chancellor, Evelyn said. Her voice echoed strangely, overlapping with 1,000 unseen whispers that vibrated through the very bedrock of the Whispering Valley. But you have forgotten the oldest law of all. My sons are not political leverage. She raised her hand. The golden flames danced wildly across her fingertips. Not used, not owned, chosen. The earth beneath Garrick's expensive boots began to physically crack, glowing brightly with deep veins of molten gold. She gazed upon the terrified old wolf. Her golden eyes burned with the wrath of a god finally awakened. The blinding shockwave of pure molten heat detonated from her fragile frame with the force of a falling star. The sheer, mythological weight of the ancient magic pressed down upon the forest floor. It forced the freezing air to crystallize into shimmering motes of light before incinerating them completely. It was not a chaotic explosion. It was a conscious, predatory expansion of the Phoenix Fire. A massive, semi-translucent dome of brilliant amber energy erupted from the exact center of the wooden porch. It swept outward. It consumed everything. The air snapped. The ground heaved. Garrick Thorne did not even have the breath to scream. The shockwave hit the High Chancellor square in his chest with the blunt force of a runaway carriage. He was lifted entirely off his feet. The older wolf flew backward through the heavy, suffocating air, crashing violently into the thick trunk of an ancient redwood. The sickening crunch of breaking ribs echoed sharply across the clearing. He slumped into the damp moss. He coughed up dark blood. His expensive velvet robes were instantly ruined by the wet, blackened earth. The 12 heavily armed soldiers were scattered like dry leaves in a winter gale. Their pristine silver breastplates dented and groaned as they hit the dirt. Their heavy iron swords were ripped from their trembling hands. They were completely paralyzed, pinned to the soil by the crushing absolute authority of the Phoenix Fire. The magic pulsed around them with a deep, rhythmic hum that vibrated inside the marrow of every living creature in the Whispering Valley. It was a sound older than the mountains, older than the crowns they served. Evelyn did not move from the top stair. She simply observed the utter destruction of the Council's vanguard with chilling, emotionless detachment. The intoxicating scent of wild moonflower had completely overpowered the clearing. It swallowed the freezing pine and ozone that usually dominated the atmosphere whenever Valerius Dracon was present. The heavy, dark sky above the Whispering Valley twisted violently, churning with a massive vortex of crimson and gold clouds. Distant howls erupted from the deep woods. The wild, feral drakes of the borderlands were throwing their heads back, singing a desperate, submissive chorus to the awakened entity. "Witchcraft," Garrick wheezed. The Chancellor clawed helplessly at the dirt, his eyes wide with primal, unfiltered terror. He tried to drag his broken body away from the glowing perimeter. "Abomination. She is a monster." Evelyn tilted her head. The radiant, terrifying light spilling from her silver-grey eyes flared brighter. "Crawl back to your stone spires, Chancellor," Evelyn commanded softly. Her voice carried the weight of 1,000 ancient queens, echoing directly inside the skulls of the defeated men. "Inform your corrupt council that the Whispering Valley is sealed. If a single silver blade ever crosses my borders again, I will not simply break your vanguard. I will burn your entire fortress to the ground." The soldiers did not wait for a second warning. Driven by pure instinctual panic, they scrambled to their feet. They abandoned their weapons. They abandoned their dignity. 2 of the guards grabbed the weeping politician by his ruined collar, hauling his broken body over the back of a panicked horse. They spurred their mounts violently, fleeing into the dark tree line as if the hounds of the underworld were snapping at their heels. In less than a minute, the immense, terrifying threat of the Lycan Council was gone, reduced to nothing but snapped branches and terrified hoofbeats fading into the cold wind. The dome of Phoenix Fire remained. It settled into a permanent, humming wall of radiant warmth, locking the sanctuary away from the freezing cruelties of the outside world. The blistering heat slowly receded from the center of the clearing, leaving only the soft, ambient glow of eternal spring. Only one man remained inside. Valerius Dracon had not been thrown backward. The ancient magic recognized the father of the heirs. It recognized the blood that ran through the twin boys, huddled safely inside the cabin, but it did not spare him its absolute crushing weight. The Alpha King was forced down. He knelt in the slush of his own melted frost, his heavy iron armor dragging him deeper into the wet, blackened mud. The Sovereign stared at the spot where the Council's authority had just been vaporized. The black-waxed Sovereign seal of Dracon lay entirely melted in the dirt, reduced to a meaningless puddle of dark sludge. The physical representation of his royal power meant absolutely nothing here. He slowly raised his head. His neck muscles strained against the lingering atmospheric pressure. He looked up at the woman standing on the porch. The blinding fire had retreated back beneath her skin, leaving her bathed in a soft, ethereal halo. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked girl from the lower districts. She was a deity. The realization of what he had destroyed crushed his ribcage. Valerius reached up with trembling, uncoordinated fingers. He unbuckled the heavy leather straps of his iron gauntlets. He tore the steel plates from his hands and threw them into the mud. He did not want armor anymore. He did not want the crown. He only wanted the agonizing void inside his chest to stop bleeding. He dragged himself forward, his armored knees carved deep, wet trenches into the thawed earth. He stopped at the very base of the wooden steps. He bowed his massive head until his dark hair nearly brushed the toes of her simple leather boots. "I was a coward," the Alpha King whispered. His voice was entirely broken, a jagged, raw sound torn from the deepest cavern of his soul. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, finally spilled over his sharp cheekbones, tracking through the dirt on his face. "I let the fear of a shifting kingdom blind me to the only truth that mattered. I let the council whisper poison into my ears. I let them convince me that a ruler needed fangs and claws, when all I ever truly needed was you." Evelyn looked down at the most feared predator in the realm. He was weeping at her feet, divested of his terrifying grace, stripped of his freezing aura, just a desperate, hollowed-out man begging for his life. "A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway," Evelyn said quietly. Her tone was not cruel, but it was agonizingly precise. "You severed the bond, Valerius. You ripped our souls apart. You left me to die in the snow." His massive shoulders shook. He grabbed the hem of his own dark cloak, his knuckles turning white as he fought to breathe through the sheer panic of her words. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," the monarch choked out. He lifted his tear-streaked face to look into her calm, silver-grey eyes. "The curse that has been consuming my heart for 5 years, it was not a magical plague. It was the physical manifestation of losing you. Every single day without you has been a living execution. Punish me, strike me down. Let your fire consume my flesh until the debt is paid. But please, Evelyn, do not send me back into the dark." He pressed his bare, trembling hands flat against the wet wood of the bottom step. He lowered his forehead until it rested against the timber, submitting his throat completely to her judgment. It was the ultimate, irrefutable gesture of surrender, the supreme predator offering his own life to the one he had wronged. "I do not want your suffering," she answered. The musical cadence of her voice carried a profound, heavy sadness. "Your pain does not erase the nights I spent shivering in this cabin, wondering how I was going to keep our children alive." Valerius flinched violently. The truth of her words was 1,000 times sharper than any silver blade. The heavy oak door of the cabin slowly creaked open. Kaelin and Balin stepped out onto the porch. They moved silently, their small hands gripping the fabric of their mother's linen dress. The twins peered at the massive, weeping warlord kneeling in the mud. They did not show fear. They showed the quiet, analyzing intelligence of their ancient bloodline. As the boys stood beside her, the ambient magic in the air shifted, a brilliant, glowing manifestation of the Lycan crest, the sacred star-shaped geometry of the founders, illuminated brightly on the foreheads of both children. Their glowing amber eyes were the undeniable proof of their divine right to rule, the ultimate vindication of the woman who had fiercely protected them. Evelyn gently placed her hands on her son's shoulders. She looked at the broken sovereign, her expression finally softening from detached indifference into something infinitely more complex. A fragile bride once waited in that freezing cathedral, wrapped in shimmering fabrics, desperately hoping her fated mate would choose her. Evelyn murmured, her gaze drifting momentarily to the distant, snow-capped peaks of the capital. "That girl is dead, Valerius. She died the moment you turned your back on her. The kingdom's cruelest decree was designed to leave her in ruins, but it only forged her. I am not a quiet shadow waiting to be claimed." The monarch lifted his head. His amber eyes were wide, desperate, hanging on to every single syllable that fell from her lips. "If I return," Evelyn stated, her voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority, "I do not return as a political compromise. I do not return to stand behind you in the throne room. I return as the supreme sovereign of the northern frost spires. The council will be dismantled. Garrick Thorn will be banished to the freezing wastes, and my sons will never be forced to hide their true nature again." Valerius did not hesitate. "Yes," he breathed instantly. "Everything, the crown, the army, my life, it is yours, it has always been yours." She slowly descended the first wooden step. The ambient heat radiating from her skin enveloped the freezing, shivering king in a cocoon of profound, desperate warmth. She reached out. Her delicate, calloused fingers brushed against his tear-stained cheek. The physical contact was an absolute explosion of sensory relief. The suffocating, frozen curse that had crushed his lungs for half a decade shattered instantly. The monarch let out a ragged, breathless sob. He leaned his massive weight into the gentle touch of her small hand. "There is no wolf too broken to be worthy," she whispered softly, her thumb brushing away a streak of dark mud from his jawline. "But you will spend the rest of your immortal life proving it to us. I swear it," he vowed, his voice fierce and trembling. "Every breath, every heartbeat, only for you." He wrapped his large arms around her waist, burying his face in the folds of her dress, weeping with the pure, unadulterated salvation of a man who had finally been permitted to come home. Above them, Kaelin and Balin watched with quiet, glowing amber eyes, the protectors of the realm standing vigilant over their parents' fragile, hard-won peace. The frost never returned to the high halls of the capital. The legendary manifestation of the Phoenix Fire in the Whispering Valley remained. It became a permanent reminder to the realm that true power is not found in fangs or iron, but in the quiet strength of a woman who refused to break. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If the warmth of this tale reached you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, would you have made the Alpha King grovel longer, or did he finally earn his redemption? I read every single one, and your words mean more than you know. Until next time, stay safe in the shadows.